What we should do is help people maximize their abilities and minimize their difficulties.
Thanks for watching Hot Flashes and Cool Topics podcast. Be sure to subscribe and ring that bell to catch all of our conversations. Now, on to the show.
Welcome back to Hot Flashes and Cool Topics podcast. Today, we are talking to Dr. Thomas Armstrong, who is the author of The Power of Neurodiversity, Unleashing the Advantages of Your Neurodivergent Brain. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Well, we were just saying off air how much we appreciated this book, especially now with just so many negative connotations going around in conversations about neurodiversity. I want to just start with, can you explain what neurodiversity is? Because I didn't realize it was such a new concept.
Right. It's only about 25, 30 years old at the most. And basically, it says that we should have the same attitude towards differences in brains that we have in terms of differences of flowers, for example, or differences of culture. We don't say that a calla lily has petal deficit disorder. We acknowledge the calla lily for what it is, for its uniqueness. Same thing with people who have labels, like autism and ADHD and dyslexia. There's been a tendency, and I was a former special education teacher, to put a deficit spin on those labels. And so this book really says we've got to stop doing that and start really examining the strengths that are associated with each of these conditions. Because, if you're growing up with, one of these neurodivergencies, you probably have been exposed to people kind of, talking about you in terms of what you can't do. And, we need to know that to help you get better at something, that's for sure. But, over and over and over again, it gets to be kind of a sap on one's own inner self-esteem. And so I'm trying to, rouse up a focus on a strength-based approach to, I think strength-based approaches have really begun to take, new momentum in the last few years. And so I'm just kind of adding to that by suggesting that we talk about, differences in brains as neurodiversities. This is a tough time to talk about diversities because in high places, there's not a lot of support. In fact, no support for diversity. Right. But we nevertheless carry on. And so that's the essence of what neurodiversity means. It was coined in about 1998, 1999 by an autism activist, Judy Singer, and also a New York journalist, Harvey Bloom. And it was kind of slow to get started, but once it got going, it just really has taken off. And I've seen, when I did this is a second edition of a book that I initially did in 2010. And in 2010, not many people knew what neurodiversity was. But when I went back to do the research to update this book, I was just floored by, it was on everybody's lips. There's been, over the last, let's say, 15 years or so, there's been a lot of research done on the strengths of people with conditions like ADHD, autism, dyslexia, intellectual disabilities. And so this research provides a lot of support for the notion that neurodiversity is a real experience, is a real phenomenon, and that we need to really support it and use its ideas in our care of individuals who are neurodivergent.
Right. I'm a former teacher as well. I was an elementary school teacher, and I'm reading through your book and I'm hearing all the people that are referenced in the book. And you also pointed out eight different principles of neurodiversity. And there were so many in there. I left the teaching field in 2012. So much has happened since then. And there were so many other things in there that we didn't consider
Right.
under this umbrella. Can you talk about just, you could start wherever you want because that's a lot of them, 8, but we could just start. Well, I really love how you said it's not a machine. Your brain is not a machine.
Right.
Yeah. Can we
Yeah.
talk about that?
Well, that's when I was in special ed, I would read about ADHD and people's attempt to explain ADHD to kids. And they would often say it's like your cockpit, you're an airline cockpit brain doesn't work quite right. Or, you've got a Ferrari brain, without the right brakes. I mean, there were all these machine metaphors. And I thought, that's not too far away from saying that a person's elevator doesn't go up to the top floor, And so we've got to be real careful, especially since the brain is not a machine. It's an organism. It's the most complex organism that we know about in the universe. It consists of trillions of neuronal connections, and it's not software. It's not hardware. It's wetware, and it's taken millions of years to evolve. And so we should really think about it more in terms of a rainforest. And I'm not the one to come up with that. A Nobel Prize winner, Gerald Edelman, came up with the idea. He said that it's almost like a Darwinian jungle in there with neurons competing against each other for attention from the outside world. Because when they respond to a stimulus from the outside world, they wire together. And if they don't, then those connections disappear. So he likened that to the, species in the wild. So I thought, why don't we talk about the brain forests instead of, machines and computers and that kind of thing. So yeah, that's really important. And it goes along with neurodiversity, which is an ecological concept. I mean, we're really talking about the ecology of learning and the ecology of growing. And so I think that that's the first principle that should impact our thinking about this matter.
Why do you think that people feel the need to have to find a blame as opposed to spending their energy on how to make things more diverse and more accepting? It's like,
right.
I don't understand why they put so much energy into what to blame for.
Well, one of the practical reasons for that is that there's no research money for diversity, whereas there is research money if you find a problem, a medical problem especially. And so that's been fueled the research industry and the government and their legislation. And I should say that all this is good. There's a good purpose behind it, good intentions certainly, in that they're trying to find reasons for behaviors that do not fit into the normal, whatever normal means, context. And I pointed out to people that there's no normal brain if you think about it. They used to have, if you went to France and went to the Department of Weights and Measurements and went into the basement, they had under 2 bell jars, they had a kilogram, just a piece of metal that represented the standard kilogram. And people around the world took their own kilograms to this place to calibrate, to make sure that they had the same weight as the normal kilogram. But there's no brain under a vat anywhere, under a bell jar in a museum or a laboratory that represents the normal brain. And if there is no normal brain, then how can we say what an abnormal brain is? It's just kind of a logical consequence. So I think that we really need to focus on helping people with neurodivergencies. I think that it's important to work on what's not working, but I think if you're going to start someplace, you should start with what's working, and then also work to help support what is difficult. And the way I put it is what we should do is help people maximize their abilities and minimize their difficulties. It's not about curing. It's not about even remediating, like getting rid of this nasty defect. It's about each of us as a whole person, living our lives and wanting to live optimal lives. And so that basically means, each of us has strengths. Everybody has strengths. And so it's a question of knowing about them. That's why I included in my book a 200-item checklist that lists all these strengths that people can go through and check. And so they can become aware of their strengths. That, to me, is the first job of any teacher or therapist or caregiver, or for the person themselves. Find out about your strengths. Find out about, that I didn't think that was a strength. Yeah, that is a strength. That's what I found in special ed. I'd say your child is really good at with Legos, or a really great painter. Oh, well, I just thought that was a talent. I just thought that was this quirky little thing that he did. No, that's a strength, and it's a very important part of who they are as a learner. So that's number one, is that we should help people understand what they're good at, but also help them deal with their, difficulties, but not by rooting them out. I mean, that's painful. It's like a root canal, helping them by, well, for example, I've got maybe a couple of lists of 8 things, and one of my lists of 8 things is something I call positive niche construction, which is it's like building a nest. It's like birds building nests, or beavers building a dam, creating an optimal environment. And so one of the things that I put on that list was using apps and other assistive technologies to work around obstacles. So that if you have dyslexia, for example, you can use speech-to-text software so that you can talk into the computer and have it print out whatever it is that you're saying. So it sidesteps that difficult period of putting your thoughts down on paper, which some people have a terrible time with dysorthographia, among other things. And so some people call them workarounds. It's a way of, if a door is closed, don't bang your head against it over and over and over again. Go and find the open door and go in there. So that's the idea behind assistive technologies. And there's so many out there now that weren't there 15, 20 years ago. I mean, it's unbelievable. I mean, for example, augmentative alternative communication devices. So someone who's nonverbal, someone who's never communicated with anybody, who has a keyboard that they can push keys saying, I'm hungry, I need to go to the bathroom, et cetera. Ouch, whatever. But some way of communicating, and it's opened up communication channels for so many people. And it's enabled them to engage with life rather than, live in this kind of isolated environment.
I loved how you pointed out in the book what we think you need in this life or at this time of life. So you pointed out that 150, 200 years ago, not everybody read. That was one thing that I would point out. Not everybody needed to read, which is great. I'm not knocking reading by any means. I love reading. However, but it was amazing when I was reading that, thinking, oh, not everybody needed this at this time, and how different things have evolved, and how it makes children, just being in the classroom. I taught kindergarten, first grade, second grade, and how you would get this group of children. I think at one time I had up to 30 children in one classroom. Mm-hmm. And trying to adapt to that, and then trying to get interventions, trying to work with special ed as well. And then you also pointed out another thing, that the least restrictive environment, and how that maybe wasn't always the best thing. I kind of asked like 4 questions right there. So, yeah. But you did point it out, so many of these things that were just aha moments to me when I was reading it. But I don't know, you can take off from there. Yeah.
Well, what I like to say to people is that there were no remedial reading instructors during prehistoric times, because no one was reading. Reading didn't exist. And consequently, a person might have been born during that time with the same kind of brain that a dyslexic person classically has, and it would have had absolutely no impact on their life. And in fact, what they're finding, of course, is that people with dyslexia often have areas of the brain that are working exceptionally well, related to things like big picture thinking and visual spatial processing. And the fact that they had those parts of their brain working in prehistoric times would have been very important because, having visual spatial intelligence living in the wild, I mean, that's where you needed it, to find out where you are and where other people were or where other animals were and that kind of thing. So, there are evolutionary reasons why these conditions exist today, why they haven't been weeded out by natural selection from the gene pool. And that's because they likely conferred evolutionary advantages on people. And thus they stayed, robust until the present day. But the context has changed. You raised the issue of context, and that's one of the things I discovered in special ed was that I shared a story of working with a child when I was working for a place called the Educational Arts Association in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And we go around and we find recycled material that we could use that teachers could put together for, various kinds of learning kits. And this one child was one of our most active and excited and enthusiastic members. And so I saw him in that way, in that context. Then I was doing a research for my master's degree at Lesley Graduate School in Cambridge. And I ran into him in a resource room in a special education program. And he was, had the same enthusiasm, the same vitality, but in that context, it was a problem. He was like a tiger in a cage, and he was driving the teacher, who was relatively inexperienced. He was driving the teacher crazy. And so I realized, it just depends upon what setting you're talking about, whether a person is going to be seen as disabled or gifted or normal or impaired or whatever it happens to be. That's why we need to be really careful with these labels. I mean, I have railed against these labels for many, many, many years. And I wrote a book called The Myth of the ADHD Child. Before that, I was railing against learning disabilities. And the thing is, my reaction against them was wise, but I didn't have something to really, really big to back myself up on. And in fact, neurodiversity is that thing because, people say, well, they do have a different brain. And I say, I agree with you. They have a different brain, different, not disabled. And that's the big difference. And I really think society is beginning to come along because ever since I did all that railing, and I certainly wasn't the only person, I've noticed the term learning differences coming back in a lot of different places. And it seems like people's awareness is changing. And that, of course, is what neurodiversity is feeding on also.
In the book, you mentioned 7 varieties of neurodiversity. Now, there are a lot more, but you picked 7 for the book. And it's autism, ADHD, dyslexia, intellectual disabilities, anxiety disorders, mood disorders, and schizophrenia.
Right.
And I wanted to start with autism because
Sure.
I think that is the hot button topic for everyone. And it seems like what I appreciated about your book is you talk about the strengths and how they can not only learn in a classroom, but autistic adults can be successful.
Right.
And I have an autistic daughter who was late diagnosed, and she's highly intelligent, so she was able to mask for years. And it was so interesting to me because there are areas now that are opening up to autistic adults, like entrepreneurship. And I love that you mentioned that in the book. But, I was surprised because you mentioned that about 5.4 million, I think you said in the book, people are autistic. And I think that number is so much higher because it's the fact that it is a spectrum.
Right.
Why,
Exactly.
Why do you think that people assume when you say autism that it's got to be severe versus moderate versus mild? Like you meet one autistic person, you meet one autistic person.
Right. I think this idea of the spectrum is only now beginning to be understood. That is one of my other principles that competency exists along a spectrum. And in fact, each of those diversities that you mentioned exists along a spectrum. Even schizophrenia, there are, you know, milder forms of schizophrenia, schizophrenic syndrome, et cetera. And then obviously there are really difficult kinds. And a lot of it depends upon how much of the brain has been affected. And of course, the one area that we use the word spectrum regularly for is autism. And I totally agree with you. It exists along a spectrum that can include, you know, if you want to, you can include people who are shy, people who are introverted, people who are a little bit eccentric, who kind of keep to themselves, you know, who would rather listen to or read a book at home rather than be at a party. I mean, that's extending it quite a ways over in the area closer to whatever it is that we call normal. And then, of course, we can go the other way. And until we get to the sort of what used to be understood as autism, which was the individual who usually is not communicative, the person who has frequently emotional meltdowns, the person who is locked into what's called rigidity and, you know, having to have things in the same way, the same structure, et cetera. But those are, you know, a few people there, a few people here, how you actually come up with a number. And I think that one of the reasons, you know, President Trump has kept on harping on how this number has been rising and it's an epidemic and it's taking over. And I think part of the reason for the number is that the diagnostic criteria has changed. And as it changes, more people become eligible. I remember the very first time I was aware of autism was in about 1975. And I attended a lecture by a woman, Claiborne Park, I think her name was. She'd written a book called The Siege about her daughter. And her daughter had, you know, I think she was there on stage, you know, pretty non-communicative. But the interesting thing is, later on, I found out she was an artist, and you can look up some of her art on the internet. But we had this kind of fixed in, locked in idea. In fact, I was at University of Massachusetts at the time, and I remember thinking or hearing that the way you could tell a person was autistic is if you said something to them and they repeated it back to you. I mean, that's how limited my understanding was and how stereotypical it was. So yeah, it's a real spectrum. It's a complex neurodivergency. It's you know, changing all the time. And your point is very, you know, as to what we were talking about before, that context is so important. And you mentioned entrepreneurship for autism, and an even bigger sort of a breakthrough is in the area of information technology. Because there's this guy in Denmark who had a business that consisted in taking the software codes from people like companies like Microsoft and going over the code meticulously, looking for errors, looking for bugs in the code, essentially. And what he discovered was that people with autism could do that better than so-called normal or neurotypical people. And that's because of research backing this up, that number one, they're very good at systems. They're systemizing so much more than empathizing, and also very good at small detail work. And so it turned out that he was hiring right and left people with autism. And right now, or at least back when I was reading the story, 3/4 of the company were people with autism. And his example started to spread. And pretty soon, software companies around the world were hiring people with autism. In fact, an article appeared in the in the Wall Street Journal saying how autism can help you land a job. which I thought is really great, because again, it's the context. Put them in certain context, and where put them in a context where they're expected to sort of go with the flow and sort of interpret other people's ambiguous signals and that kind of thing. And they're going to just really do bad, and they're going to get frustrated, and that's going to come out perhaps in a meltdown. But put them in an environment where they can be left alone to work on their own, to focus on systems like a computer language, focused on small details, and they're in their element. This is, you think about your own situation. Where in life are you in your element, where you're really smoking and you're feeling like needed, and you're feeling like whole, and you're feeling like, this is what I was put on earth to do. And that's essentially what we need to do for each neurodivergent person, is help them find that place. And we should start, in terms of career, we should start doing that in the elementary grades, helping kids, first of all, understand their gifts, their abilities, their intelligences. And second of all, starting to become acquainted with places out there in the real world that would love having someone with your particular gift. And then we wouldn't leave them at the end of high school or college, flailing about. I mean, we should do this for all kids, obviously, because we're not doing it for anybody right now. And it has a lot to do with why college depression is so high. But, the context is really important to keep in mind.
Right. My husband worked for a company, he's retired now, where they were starting to look at people, neurodivergent people. And and I can't remember, I wish I could cite whatever study or whatever reference it was, but they're also the loyalty of the people that work there.
Yeah.
That he said that job turnover with them does not happen, that they're very loyal employees.
That came up for me too when I was working on the chapter on intellectual disabilities. Intellectual disabilities is an area in which people say, well, these other areas, maybe there's diversity, but this is, these are, I won't use the R word, but, and so it's, they're really born that way, really using kind of stereotypical thinking. But in fact, like each of those other neurodivergencies, people with Down syndrome, for example, have incredible personalities. They're warm, they're very interactive, they're dramatic. Some of them make amazing actors and actresses. And as you point out, they're loyal. They get into a job, once they understand what's expected of them, and assuming that they, have a good optimal environment to work in, they stick with the job, as opposed to so many other people who, take on, I won't poke any barbs at any particular generation, but we do have a case of young adults who seem to have, no deep commitment to a work life, to a lifelong attitude of loyalty and persistence and stick-to-itiveness. Whereas in this particular group of individuals, as well as in some of the other neurodiversities, we do have that element. And, people say, well, what you're talking about is all well and good, but in the real world, well, I'm talking about the real world. In the real world, it is important to have these things: loyalty, have a warm personality. When I bring this up to people, I say, okay, if you're on a desert island, who would you rather be on that desert island with? Someone with Down syndrome who has a warm, engaging personality, or someone with a high IQ score who's a total jerk? And you got to, make a choice there. And I think most people would choose the first option. And that's because when it comes to real life, that's what we want. We want to be around people who are, one book was suggested that was written by people with Down syndrome, said we'd like to call it up syndrome instead of Down syndrome, because that's kind of where our mood is at, assuming that we're not being bullied and looked down on and having insults hurled our way, which is a big problem and needs, as part of the niche construction. One of my other components of niche construction is looking at your overall social network. We all live in the midst of a social network of relationships. We have good relationships, we have not so good, sometimes we have really bad ones. Some of them are professional, if we're seeing a therapist, or educational, if we have teachers, that kind of thing. But our overall aim should be to provide ourselves, or to have somebody help us with creating as optimal a social network as possible. That means, and so many neurodivergent people end up, if you look at their social networks, they've got parents who are harping on them. You've got teachers who are railing at them for not being on grade level. You've got bullies in their world who are threatening them to beat them up after school, or making fun of their quote unquote disabilities. So those things need to be changed, actively changed. Sometimes by finding another teacher. I found that sometimes the disability that a child would have would disappear as soon as they had a new teacher that they got along with, where there wasn't a kind of constant pullback, power struggle kind of thing going on. So so that's another important aspect of the ecology, or the niche construction process, is creating an optimal environment of interaction with people. And so I say, surround yourself with people who see the best in you. That comes not from me, but from Jack Canfield, who was one of my early mentors, who wrote Chicken Soup for the Soul, and other related books. He said, he impressed me with the idea that, don't hang around people who are energy parasites. You want to be around people who acknowledge you, see the best in you, who you feel inspired by. And I think, fortunately, in the schools, there are a lot of great teachers, and especially in special ed, there are a lot of amazing teachers that have chosen a very challenging vocation, but have the personalities to pull them off. So, but, there's always somebody in the environment who's not that way. And so, part of the process of helping individuals who are neurodivergent involves going in and doing an assessment, and then seeing what you can do. Obviously, you can't, it's not like a shell game. You can't just take this person and switch him over here and bring the positive person in. It takes a lot of work and needs a lot of strategizing. But I think at least it gives us a focus for our energies.
I also wanted to explore the second one that you talk about is ADHD. And I know from my girls are now adults, but when they were in school, so many kids were on ADHD medication.
Right.
And I wonder your opinion on, number one, getting them diagnosed at a very early age. Some were two. And two, the need. And then again, as they got older, some of them took it just to do better on tests.
Right.
I'm curious about your opinion on the use and misuse of medication and diagnoses.
Right. That's great question. I have a rather complex relationship to ADHD. I wrote a book called The Myth of the ADHD Child, and got a lot of people angry because they thought I was saying that there was no such thing as hyperactivity, distractibility, and impulsivity, which was the last thing in the world that I wanted to do. Obviously, as a special ed teacher, I knew that these kids had difficulty paying attention, sitting in their seats, behaving appropriately in a school setting, et cetera. And the medication issue, I came down fairly hard on until I went on medication. This was back in about 1992, and I was going to Holland to teach in a program, and there were a lot of stresses. I was going to have to teach at my aunt's school at the Amsterdam International School. I was terrified about that, and then I was going to go to Russia, where, in fact, Yeltsin was, destabilizing the country. And I just broke down and I didn't sleep for 5 days. So when I went back home, I got some, antidepressants essentially, because I have depression in my family and myself too, unipolar depression. And so my attitude towards medication changed a bit. And I said, oh, maybe these medications have a role to play. And I think that they do. I'm not just saying that because of myself, because, the literature suggests that in some cases, medication can help turn a child's life around by providing a kind of a foundation for success. But having said that, I think the ADHD issue has a lot of problems with it. Again, because of the issue of what's their brain like? Is it brain damage? Is it brain difference? In fact, it is brain difference because research suggests that the brain of a person who's ADHD matures 2 or 3 years later than a neurotypical child. It develops normally, but it develops later. So basically, we're talking about, and I don't want to get into this idea of neoteny. Neoteny means holding youth. And it seems to be one of the most amazing parts of being human, that humans are different from other lower down or other over there creatures in that we are born and have more of our development in youth, and we're more youthful later on in life. Whereas the chimpanzee, looks very kind of childlike, but then immediately grows into a very old, kind of, severe looking creature. So in fact, kids with ADHD have more of this than the neurotypical person. They're more apt to be youthful later on in their life. And that is not just a plus, but it's actually one of the key elements in evolution. And to that extent, they're forerunners of the vanguard of evolution in human beings. And the fact that we should be using 3 negatives, that's what really gets me. You see my excitement comes when we talk about ADHD. We use 3 negatives to talk about them. Attention's neutral, hyperactivity is negative, deficit is negative, disorder is negative. And so we're taking 3 negatives and describing someone who's in fact in the vanguard of human evolution. That doesn't make a lot of sense, And then they have something called hyperfocus, which has more recently been seen as one of the warning signs of ADHD. And hyperfocus is kids getting interested in something and just becoming totally absorbed in it and losing track of the time and that kind of thing. And that's actually a good thing. If your child spends a lot of time focusing on something that interests them, Montessori called that the great work. She said that's the pinnacle of learning when a child moves into a space like that. A University of Chicago psychology professor called it flow. And he studied it as an optimal condition of functioning. He studied it in rock climbers, in artists, in surgeons who will operate for like 15 hours, totally absorbed. And then when they are finished, they'll feel totally energized. And so again, you're looking at something that is like the pinnacle of human functioning, and you're saying it's a symptom of a disorder. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me either.
And it's another thing that mentally puts this group that already is feeling different.
Right.
It's putting them down one more time, because I have a child who was diagnosed with diagnosed ADHD as well. And, going through school and how difficult that was.
Right.
So that's just another thing on top of that's putting them down. And I also love how you include just different ways of educating, different things you can do in a classroom that could be helpful for anybody
right.
on a different neurodivergent spectrum. And I love the part going outside. Just
nature is so important for ADHD, because the more nature that is out there, in other words, the wilder the environment, the more their symptoms go down. So it's, providing an optimal environment for them. A researcher at Purdue University, Sydney Zantal, also was onto this. She said that people with what they call then hyperactivity are understimulated. They're not overstimulated. People would think they're overstimulated. And they used to have a classroom called the Crookshank classroom for such children, and it had absolutely nothing in it. And the teacher was told even not to not put on red lipstick for fear that that would overstimulate the child. And so it turns out the truth is exactly the opposite. They are understimulated. The reason they're hyperactive is to create more stimulation. And they've noticed if they allow children to fidget in class, they do better. You know, they have these bouncy bands and, you know, wiggle balls, stability balls, ways for them to be able to move. And they've found that they can study better, they can think better, they can attend better. So, you know, we should be thinking about educational stimulation first. And if that's not working, then think about medical, you know, stimulants, because that's what Ritalin and what Adderall are. They're stimulants. And they provide that optimal stimulation for the child.
Right. And I do remember they would advocate, don't take away recess from these children.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, don't take away. But
The
I do
worst thing.
remember another time we couldn't call it recess. We had to say gross motor skills. And I remember that was some law. And so on my schedule, I had to put gross motor skills. And
it's just so silly.
It was so silly. But I do remember that was a big thing. And I you know, you don't want to take away their recess. I mean,
No.
Especially that age.
Yes.
Too,
Yes. That was,
it's like take the one thing that they're succeeding at away from them and expect them to do better. That's crazy thinking. That's crazy thinking.
Right.
My administrator told me I had a thing in my classroom called free time, where I'd have a lot of activities. And she said, don't call it free time, call it choice time.
I know. Oh, it was so, you have no idea, Colleen.
Thank you. I don't know. That just sounds very complicated.
Yeah.
Like overcomplicating a simple concept is
right.
what.
Yes.
And I do, as I was reading your book, I did know some of these are crossovers. Like they may have one and something of another. That's a common theme as
Very
well.
Common. Right? Yeah. And it's called comorbidity, you know, another wonderful word. Comorbidity means you can have ADHD and also be learning disabled and also, you know, have an intellectual disability or whatever. And there's a lot of crossover, as you mentioned. To me, this is a way of trying to cope with the fact that each child is a complex human being with a variety of issues. And what they're saying is they've got a variety of problems, and some of them seem to be associated with this disorder, some with that disorder. It can be very confusing, but it helps the professional deal with the situation that it could be, if a child's not paying attention, that they're depressed. And so they're not able to focus their attention because inattention is a symptom of depression. And to me, that was another kind of warning sign or red flag. You know, if you're having trouble or if you're taking something that doesn't fit into your existing way of thinking about things and you're saying, well, that could also be part of it. You know, if you say, well, what about the fact that depression can also cause inattention? Well, depression can also be part of ADHD. So you sort of solve the problem. And at any rate, comorbidity is important. If I were to put on my more traditionalist hat, I would say it's obviously important to do a good diagnosis in the beginning. And that diagnosis should include the strengths as well as the disabilities. And that's what's missing for the most part. There's a lot of checklists for ADHD, but no strength checklist. There ought to be a strength checklist like I created in my book that goes along with every of the standard checklists so that you can have that information available to you as well. Doctors are not trained this way, however. That's another reason why the focus is always on the problem. Doctors are trained to treat diseases. They are trained in the medical model. They don't take courses in anthropology and sociology, most of them not in developmental psychology, although developmental and behavioral pediatricians do have that familiarity. But they're not interdisciplinary thinkers, which I think is what is required in order to really fully understand and pick apart the different aspects of a child's behavior complex.
I was going to ask for someone who would want, because I was like 1/4, I think in your book you said 1/4 of Americans at some time could have a psychotic episode within a given year.
Yeah.
Where would someone go if they wanted to get a really good thorough assessment to see, hey, something's going on with me, wonder if I fall into this category? Where would be a good place to really get a good assessment?
Well, I think either a psychiatrist or a psychologist. If it was psychosis, I'd go to a psychiatrist with experience working with psychosis. But, psychologists with the appropriate training and background can also be good. Those would be the two that I would go to.
Okay. Yeah. I think also towards the end of the book, you talk about the future of neurodiversity and the challenges that you call it the 6 challenges to neurodiversity survival.
Right.
And, again, part of it is political bias and personal bias. People are afraid to tell someone if they do fall within one of the neurodiverse categories because of the response they're going to get from other people.
Right.
And is there something that we can do to make it maybe easier for them to survive in this world? Because I do love the fact that you talk about neurodiversity in the classroom and then you go neurodiversity in the workplace.
Right.
Because these children grow up and they need to be able to function in the world. So what can we do to support them to make it without like doing too much, I guess?
We as who?
As parents, as teachers, as just family members, friends.
Employers. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, I think, we need to take the same kind of approach that we would for racial discrimination, for example, or gender discrimination. We need to raise awareness. We need to, if somebody uses a racial slur or a disability slur, we need to stop the action and say, okay, what's going on? You use that word. What does that word mean to you? How do you think she feels? How do you feel when you have somebody saying that word? Those kind of sessions need to go on, and damn the curriculum. You need to deal with what's critically important first, because otherwise it's just going to come up again and again and sabotage your lesson plans. So, being active, being aware, being person-centered so that you're not going to put somebody down for using, discriminatory language, but you're going to actively want to explore. Well, what's your thinking about that? Oh, my dad uses that term all the time. And my dad can't be wrong. What do you do when he says or she says something like that? Well, maybe then we need to sit down with your dad. And it does ask a lot of the teacher or the therapist to attempt this, because it is systemic and it isn't just connected to just one person. It's this person learns it from this person who learned it from this person who learned it from it goes all the way back. But we need to do it nevertheless, because it is, as Colleen said, it really gets in the way. And it creates masking. You're afraid to come out of the neurodiversity closet because, you're going to be put down for it. And so, I think the other part of that is creating an atmosphere in the classroom that is neurodiversity positive, so that you celebrate Neurodiversity Day, so that you have neurodiversity festivals that honor the great things that people with neurodivergence have been able to do in life. One of my key ingredients for niche construction is being aware of all the exemplars or the positive role models of people who have done amazing things with these disabilities or with these descriptions. So you've got Temple Grandin having done a marvelous job of advocating for autism. And you got, ADHD, Steven Spielberg, dyslexia, John Irving, the novelist. There are novelists and writers who have dyslexia. That's important, I think, for people to understand. And people with intellectual disabilities. There are Jason Kingsley, who is an actor, who's written a book. There are amazing people out there, and those should be our inspiration. And for letting people know, there's not something wrong with that person. This person is just like you, except that they're different. And let's explore differences. It should go along with any kind of cultural diversity, racial diversity program, really. Any DEI program.
Yes, that's a whole nother topic.
Yeah,
it is.
Today,
we won't get into that here.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Dr. Armstrong, thank you so much for coming on the show. Thank you for writing this book. I think it's going to help so many people. We'll have the link in the show notes, and you have such great resources in the book as well. We want to let our listeners know. But thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Colleen. Thank you, Bridgett. It was wonderful being on your show. I appreciated your questions.